Good day, everyone. We're given a task to discuss about the chapter 6 entitled Employee and Industry Relations. Over the past few decades, there has been confusion between the two terms, which are the employee relations and industry relations. So first, let's tackle about the employee relations. What is employee relation? Revolves around a smaller subset of industries and goes beyond the collective such as trade unions. This is no longer just focused on factory work, manufacturing jobs, but now also includes the service sector, the non-union entities, part-time and contractual workers. These terms generally focus on the restrictions and agreements between the industry to its workers in various levels of collectivization as a union or as an individual. So, industry relation. What is industrial relations? The term is synonymous and associated with collectives such as mass movements of workers, trade union, and others. It was also linked to industrial work such as manufacturing sector, labor-intensive task, and manufacturing factory work that are full-time. The tone of industrial relations were thought of to be more focused on collective action such as bargaining agreements. Before the Industrial Revolution, work was more inclined to factory work. Now, the factory's idea has diminished also because of the technology and evolution of labor demand from workers. Overall, industry and employee is having a relationship between the company and its workers where it is seen as a unitary entity and working toward a common goal, bargaining between conflict and resolution.
Psychological contract and why it matters. An intangible agreement between both parties binds the relationship between the employer and their employees. This means that the relationship within the corporate structure is guided and predicated on a set of practices and expectations between them. There exist various sets of assumptions that may not be bound by a solid contract but are nonetheless practices that are accepted and expected in the relationship between the employee and their employees. Examples of these norms are both parties observe fairness and transparency, employee impact and value are recognized and rewarded by the employer in various forms such as benefits, tenure, or career growth. Both employer and employee will work toward the shared goal of growth that will be beneficial for both parties based on shared values, morals, and vision. So, the psychological contract drives employee satisfaction and motivation, which in turn creates more value to the organization through better work quality and output. In addition to the broad prescriptions I've mentioned, the employees themselves seek specific conditions that will further elevate their sense of belongingness and self actualization, which could be but are not limited to community building among peers, tenure and security, corporate mobility and promotions, expansions of skill sets and training, humane treatment, work life balance or integration, having their voices and suggestions heard by the management, impact and performance are duly rewarded, flexibility on tasks and processes. So the employee already have their specific conditions. The industry also has their standards or set of standards on its employee in a cycle where both of them benefited in their work engagement. First, proactive and willing to learn, has the necessary skills and competence to work on designated tasks. A team player willing to work with others, focused on achieving the goals set by the organization, has the initiative to work on tasks with minimal supervision. So the said condition or expectations is are not only expectations that both parties may demand from each other because sometimes it may vary from different scenarios, organizational dynamics, intensity, extensity, and other forms. But what is common to them is that the harmony between the employer and the employee must exert the best effort to derive the best from their work and task, therefore elevating overall productivity and value across the organizational hierarchy. So, why psychological contract matters? It matters because at its heart, the psychological contract is about trust and mutual obligations. It's that idea they have in their head that I do this because in return you are going to do that. Just like when you decide to offer the candidate the job and they choose to accept, they aren't just accepting the words written in black and white on the offer letter, the contract of employment, and the employee handbook. They are also accepting the unwritten ideal they have created in their own head. Intangible agreement means you didn't sign it, you cannot see it or touch it, but it is there. Then, the unwritten ideal, along with the contract, offer letter, and handbook, is their basis for deciding what the job is worth to them and how much effort they are prepared to put into the job. The better the deal looks to them, the more effort they will put in, and vice versa. So be very clear about this because their unwritten ideal isn't a sign of some fantasy thinking on their part. They have a firm foundation for this unwritten ideal, which is based on their interpretation and beliefs about what they think you promised them during the recruitment process. That, in essence, is their psychological contract with you. This unwritten contract, this psychological construction, is all the things they believe they can expect from their employer and their job based on what you have said or not said, or implied or not refuted.
In relationship attachment, there is compliance and commitment. First, we're going to talk about compliance. So, what is compliance? The word itself conjures ideas of submission and power. It is a term used across industries to describe rules and policies that prohibit or regulate specific products, services, or processes. In the relationship between employee and employer, compliance has different forms and root sources of power present in this interaction. It is according to Itzioni 1975. There are three sources of power. First is coercive. It is a power to impose punishments or remove benefits as perceived by the follower. Next is remunerative. It is the total compensation received by an employee. It includes not only base salary but any bonuses, commission payments, overtime pay, or other financial benefits that an employee receives from an employer. The last sources of power is normative. Normative power controls through allocation of intrinsic rewards such as interesting work, identification with goals, and making a contribution to society. Examples of such organizations are churches, political organizations, hospitals, universities, and professional associations. There are also three forms of involvement. First is alienative. Alienative is an intense negative involvement orientation of lower participants within an organization. It is according to Itzioni and Lima 1980, Lindbergh 2012. Second is calculative. It is low intensity involvement orientation of lower participants within an organization. It can be positive or negative in direction. Again, it is according to Itzioni and Lima 1980, Lonenberg 2012. The last involvement is moral. It is intense, positive involvement orientation of lower participants within organization by Itzioni and Lima 1980, Lonenberg 2012. Itzioni explained that the sources of power and forms of involvement could be combined, making it 9 different combinations. An example of this is if a worker's involvement or reaction toward a task is alienating or negative, resulting in him or her being negligent, then it could be best for the company to be coercive toward the employee to correct the action or subdue the damage to be incurred. Another example is if the act is calculative to the point that is resulted in positive growth and development, then the company may be remunerative in their approach. Lastly, suppose an employee acted positively and is in line with the moral standards and examples for the organization. In that case, the individual may be given awards of recognition that may bring prestige to the one to be rewarded. Another relationship attachment is commitment. Again, following to Itzioni, commitment is about involvement or moral bond between employer and employee in sharing an optimistic view that leads to a mutually beneficial relationship. In the 90s, commitment is defined as a belief leading to employees creating positive value and even beyond the expected output. On both definitions, commitment is assumed as a bond between employees and employers and have a behavior that can be described and differentiated from others. So experts see that commitment has slight variations between them that can be split into 2 distinct forms. The first form of commitment is attitudinal commitment. It can be distinguished with a psychological bond of the employer and employee that is held by common norms and values. Second is behavioral commitment. It can be described as going beyond expectations or loyalty to the company. It should be noted that differences in work environments depend on the culture, industry need, contractual obligation, and traditions of the environment. Thus, bonds can be interpreted in various magnitudes with slight variation in a common theme. An example of this would be the level of commitment by contractual employees. Comparing it to the full-time employees would be faulty. The contractual employees may not exhibit the same level of commitment because of the limited time he or she expected to engage with the company. Communication between the employer and employee is key to building the base of this relationship to ensure employee involvement is present in all aspects of this bond. Within an organization that is well managed, workers are expected to yield more value in a workplace that best supports their interests. The goals of building employee and employer relationship aim to foster values that are important for high performing groups such as espousing teamwork, proactivity and continuous improvement or what the Japanese call kaizen.
Two sides of the coin, cooperation and conflict. Relationship between the employee and the employer is best achieved in an environment of mutual support and transparency to reach the desired goals. Cooperation and conflict are two sides of the same coin. Both arise out of man's relationship with his fellows. The larger the group, the greater the possibility of development through cooperation, and the greater the possibility of conflict. Cooperation and conflict exist and are a part of this ongoing and never ending interaction. Conflict and corporations are more akin to the push and pulls to the system, and like your laws of physics, minute variations of action contribute to the reactions of other variables in the system. Cooperation is when two or more parties agree on the same solution to a problem. Even though their ideas are different, they come up with a good solution together and work things out. Conflict is an interaction between two or more parties wherein at least one party perceives another as threatening or preventing its needs from getting met. So when a conflict does arise, we can take a needs-based approach to understand what needs I have, which I might perceive as not being met, or what needs the other person might have that he or she doesn't feel are being met or perceives as being threatened. We can then use some needs-based strategies to try to quickly get our own needs met if necessary, and to get the other person's needs met, or at least restore perception that needs aren't being threatened so that we can get back to a state of cooperation and hence peace. All conflict resolution has a goal of getting back to a state of cooperation. In other words, getting all parties met as best we can, and thus ultimately entering a state of mutual peace. Central to this relationship is this idea of perspective. Therefore, it should be clarified that perspective is not a view per se, but is the way or approach to view a certain idea, context, or worldview. Fox 1966 identified that this frame or reference has three different frames, and these are unitarist, pluralist, and radical Marxist. References which were then expanded in the 90s with the inclusions of the feminist perspective. Unitarism or unitarist. As the term suggests, it is a view that assumes that companies and their employees are like-minded and thus share various commonalities such as norms and aspirations. Also, central to this perspective is the role of the management and its role as the primary authority over its subordinates, while at the same time the reasons for employee loyalty. Unitarist approach consists of all members sharing the same interests and being homogeneous. Third parties are viewed as irrelevant as employees and employers have mutual cooperation. Unitarism consists of management and staff's members sharing a common goal through their loyalty towards the organization. According to Wood and Elliott, 1997, the Royal Commission research paper Fox argued that the unitary ideology was not a realistic ideology, since it denied the legitimacy of conflict. This emphasized that organizations will experience conflict despite the interests of employers and employees. In addition, companies with this approach may experience poor communication and misunderstanding between the employees and employers, ultimately limiting the company to the performance of employment relationships.
Pluralism. The difference between unitarism and pluralism is that pluralism looks into the diversity of individuals and acknowledges it. Therefore, it accepts the notion that there are differences in objectives, norms, and perspectives, which then creates groups or unions. These groups then create their networks and power structures that may or may not overlap in their goals and preferences, leading to conflict. An example of this is the varying functions of departments that may be conflicting to the motives of the other. A simple representation of this may be in the direction in which the finance and purchasing departments may conflict with the budget and strategy. Another example of conflicts that may arise may be on the bounds of job rules and processes that may differ from group to group. For a pluralist, these kinds of conflicts are welcomed and anticipated, and the commitment of the workers is not centered on the management but to their interest. Managers in this perspective are not the be all and end all of leadership, but a shared structure of power with their subjects or employees. Managers here seek compromise through more engagement and conflict resolution. Differences in this manner are seen as part of managerial process necessary for the facilitation of leadership and bargaining with employees. Radical or Marxist. Class and exploitation of workers are the central notions behind the radical or Marxist perspective. In a much simpler sense, the employer is seen as the evil that merely exploits worker for labor to derive surplus value which is only accessible to the capitalist and not the laborers themselves. To make a profit, it is acknowledged by believers of this perspective that it can only be extracted by employing cheap labor that costs way less than the final product. This alienation from work is the driving force for Marxists through the fuels class, division, and exploitation. So, take note, it is understood in this perspective that labor plus technology plus capital is equal to goods and services with surplus value. Tying this belief down to society at large, the same class conflict exists within organizations all because Marxists see that the system is unjust and only reinforces the machine of the rich to accumulate more. In conclusion, this employee relation is merely one-sided and exploitative, which is impossible to resolve unlike the unitarist and pluralist. Conflict in this sense is unavoidable, and resolution through mediation is impossible, all because Marxists see compromise and collective bargaining agreements as a surrender to the capitalist machine. Therefore, only reinforces the cycle than break it. The radicals or Marxists only see revolution as an escape and final solution to break the cycle of exploitation and end the practice once and for all in a class war against the capitalists.
Industrial relations as a system. An industrial relations as a system consists of the whole range of relationship between employees and employers, which are managed by the means of conflict and cooperations. In 1958, a man named John Thomas Dunlop created the idea of industrial relations as a system. For Dunlop, he sees that the system rooted in the ideas of inputs, process, and outputs. So, in outputs, Dunlop says outputs defined by substantive and procedural rules that manage the main characters or actors within an industrial environment. So, the difference in the substantive and procedural rules for some is rather unclear and hard to grasp. So substantive rules result of rules such as hourly wages. So substantive rules pertain to issues involving the wages, salaries, hours of work, in other terms and conditions of employments. For example, a claim to recover for breach of contract or negligence or the fraud would be a common law substantive right. A state or federal statute giving an employee the right to sue for employment discrimination would also create a substantive rights. Procedural rules result of compromise about the system. So, on the other hand, the procedural rules relate to the rules governing disciplines, redundancy, settlement of disputes, periodicity of meetings, renewal of collective agreements, or it is part of the law that deals with legal process. Danilo does not explain that these rules can only come into existence through the mutual agreements of employees and employers. And further, these rules can be written, verbal, and customary rules as adopted by the organizations over a period of time. So, procedural rules commonly define substantive rules in the simplest sense. Substantive rules emanate from procedural rules, such as an example of how both parties negotiate wages. Just as was said previously, the byproduct of the interactions between two parties is then translated as a substantive rules, and outputs are the outcome of these that then in turn governs the system moving forward. So these procedural rules vary from cultures, customs, and ethics, not only from the perspective of organizations but also from country to country. So next is the inputs. Again, for Dunlop, there are the three pillars that are independent variables under inputs. So these are the actors, the context, and the ideology. So in actors, a group comprised of laborers who are not part of the managerial level. So in actors, uh, not managerial level. So these are the financials, the cashiers, the accountants, and the bank tellers. Then, so a part of the managerial level, so these are the supervisor, the section officers, and all other executives. So next is the group comprised of managers that may also include the employee collectives. And the last is the exogenous agencies that exist beyond the employee-employer relations, such as government agencies, national labor associations, and others.
Market influence. Economics and the market play a huge part in industrial relations, such as that of emerging market trends, a global competition that pressures firms to be more accommodating and flexible to employee terms. In market influence, the industrial relations are greatly influenced by economics and the market. For example, developing market trends and worldwide competitiveness force businesses to be more accommodating and adaptable to employee terms. Technological influence. The impact of disruptive innovation plays an important role in the system, such as that of drastic changes to production practices, which will force the industry to adapt to the skill sets, manpower requirement, and labor to achieve targets. So, in technological influence, disruptive innovation has a significant impact on the system, such as when production processes are drastically altered. This force This forces the industry to adjust to new scale requirements, labor demands, and labor costs in order to meet goals. Ideology.
For the system to find a consensus, the inputs are turned to outputs with the help of a process in which actors are subjected. These processes include the collective bargaining agreements in resolving the conflict by arriving at a consensus where both parties agree upon.